All right, hello everyone. Hilary, thank you for having me here. It's lovely to see some of you and to read your names, and it means the world that you're here, that you're interested. And I have a soft spot for Chicago because my eldest son is about to start, in a perfect world, he's going to start university there in the fall. In the world that we live in, he's probably not going to start in the fall, but he will eventually go to Chicago, I hope. So I hope to go and visit you. Just a little bit about myself. I live in London, England, where it's usually gray and horrible. Today it's really sunny, so I'm in a weird spot. So if I seem uncomfortable, it's because it's really sunny in London, and there's never any sunshine, so I had to move my desk around a little bit. And that's it. I grew up in Venezuela. I moved to London 20 years ago. I've got a family, 3 children, 3 dogs, a husband. And my life for the last 10 years has been this book. But I have to tell you that, and I thought I would tell you little things. I'm assuming most of you have read the book, so I'm not going to bore you with what the book is about. I'm going to tell you instead a little bit about my journey of discovery, really, and the research. And I'm going to start by telling you that this was actually not meant to be a book at all. So I didn't start this thinking, there we go, I'm going to have a book published by Scribner. I started by thinking that actually I wanted to find my roots, and I wanted to solve the mystery of my father. And I always knew as I was growing up, I think I always knew that my father kept secrets. What I didn't realize is that these secrets were so huge and so intrinsic to who he was and to who I was. And when I first started piecing this together, so about 10 years ago, and possibly before that, I felt really cheated. I felt cheated of an inheritance, of a story, perhaps of a full relationship with my father. But I realize now that he was so traumatized by what he lived through and by what his family lived through that he just couldn't have the past and the present connect in any way. So now that I am where I am, I suppose, I'm actually hugely grateful to him that he left his story for me as a puzzle that I would solve, because it's made the journey of discovery really full and worthwhile. And it's allowed me to go on an adventure and to find people that I might not otherwise have met or known about, and to discover them in many ways much more fully than I would have normally. So having been angry at my father for keeping secrets from me, I'm actually hugely grateful that he left me all the clues that he did so that I could solve piece together this mystery. I thought I would tell you a little bit about the research process, because there's a lot of that that's not in the book, and I think we're all a little interested maybe in finding out a little bit about our families and about where we come from, and that all of a sudden with 23andMe and Ancestry.com and all the websites it seems a lot more feasible, I think, than it did in the past. So for me, this all started really when I was a little girl with a box that I found in 1979, 1980. It's actually, I have the box for you, and I'm not going to distract you with lots of things, but when I was a little girl, and sorry, I'm going to try to be careful with this, I found this ID card, and I don't know if you can see it there, but that is the ID card that my father had in Berlin in 1943. And it has the date, and I hope you can see it. It has a photograph of a young man who I knew was my father and a completely different name. So I think that's really when it started. But I was a little girl, and I was scared of my dad, and I was used to not having questions answered. So when I say it really started there, I think the questions really started there. But I couldn't really solve the mystery then. Life got in the way. My parents got divorced. I got sent to boarding school. And then I became a teenager. And I think, as all teenagers, I was more concerned with differentiating myself from from my parents than with finding my roots. And then in my late teens, I had that experience at Tufts University, which is in the book, where someone came up to me and said, "You're Jewish," which was pretty astonishing. And then there were other clues. There was another friend of mine who had grown up in Venezuela, who was half Jewish, I suppose. So his mother was a Russian Jewish immigrant. His father had been a Catholic Venezuelan writer, and he had converted at the age of 14. And his mother and my father were good friends, and he had actually said to me, I think you're more Jewish than you realize." And he had given me all these books to read about Judaism. But I then had really no idea about how Jewish, if that is a thing, how Jewish I was. And I certainly didn't know anything about my father's family. And then things sort of started moving quite fast. In around 2000, I turned 30. I got married. My father died, and my son was born 3 weeks later. And then my father left me that box again, which doesn't have all the papers that it does now, but as you can see, is pretty full and crammed still today with things and with papers. And life again got in the way, in the sense that I was having little kids, and I thought, I can't plunge into this darkness. Yes, I want to know the answers. Yes, I want to find my roots. And it became more important as I had children to find those roots. But I also thought it's going to be really dark and harrowing, and I just don't know that I'm in the right space in my life to cope with, reading fairy tales and Hungry Caterpillar to my kids and delving into the past. But I started tentatively asking questions, and my uncle's widow was still alive, and I asked her, and she didn't really want to speak about it, but she sent me a box of letters, which were the letters from my grandparents in the concentration camp of Terezin. And I knew a little bit about Terezin. I studied history at Tufts, so I knew quite a lot about what happened, but I didn't realize how unusual my letters were in terms of quantity and the quantity of detail inside them. And the fact that they were snuck out was quite unusual. And I sent them to a translator, and the translator sort of said, "Wow, you have a treasure trove here. They're quite remarkable," and put me in touch with a historian. And then it all started sort of gaining speed. So around 2011, I don't speak Czech and I don't speak German. So I hired a Czech researcher who all of a sudden sent me a document saying, "This is your family." And then all I knew was that I had an uncle called Lothar, a father obviously called Hans, that I had grandparents called Otto and Ella, and that I had an uncle, or my father had an uncle, so my great uncle Richard I knew was around. But I didn't know there were 30 other people. So I was quite astounded by the sheer just size of the family tree. And I started, reading the letters a bit more boldly perhaps, and looking at the names, and started piecing it all together, and ended up tracing people in everywhere from Indonesia to France to the Czech Republic to Melbourne, Australia, to California. And I think what was really astonishing about that process, and really made the journey quite beautiful, was that people were really willing to connect, and people were incredibly generous. There wasn't a single person that I reached out to. And often I reached out in quite unusual ways. So, I'd send emails, I'd leave messages on answer phones. I was really invading people's privacy without they had no notice, So it was, and yet they all were incredibly open. And I was really hugely lucky that a lot of them had documents. And while my own family didn't know very much about their own family history, the children of the friends of the family, of those people that helped my family, all knew. So it was unusual in that the friends seemed to know more about my own family than my own family members. But what was marvelous was how generous and open and how filled with love all these people and willingness to help all these people were. So more boxes started to arrive. I'm hugely lucky that I've amassed over 1,000 pieces of documentation. And it's taken me almost 10 years, and there are mysteries that are still unsolved. I think the big ones are solved, but I still have little ones. And I haven't quite made my peace with that. So I'm still trying to solve a few little mysteries here and there. And I guess that's just to say again that this didn't start itself as a book. And it became a book because as I pieced the stories together, I realized that there were some quite beautiful stories of love and of courage and of hope. And if I didn't tell the stories, it didn't seem like anyone else was going to. And they were just going to remain buried, veiled in this sort of unspoken, in the silence. And somehow that would allow, and I'm not quite sure, but that would allow the Nazis to really win. So I decided that telling their stories was a form of resistance, a form of saying, you know what, evil doesn't win. Remembrance and love is what wins. And so then I decided I was going to tell the story, and for that reason, and because actually most of my family members didn't know anything, so my cousins in California didn't know that anyone had died in the Holocaust. They didn't even know they were Jewish at all. And they had no idea, again, a bit like me, of the sheer number of them. So I promised them that I would write a book, and I haven't quite written the book yet because it's about 2,000 pages, and I don't think Scribner would publish it because it's too big and there's too many stories and too many characters. So the book that you read was born in 2017. It was born by chance, really, in that someone said, you really have to make this more accessible to everybody than just your family. And you have to condense it a bit because otherwise no one's going to read it. So the book that's 2,000 pages is still, I'm still working on it, and that will contain all the little mysteries, and you don't have to read it. But the book that you did read, I hope, is sort of the core of that. And I guess that's it. I'm very happy to talk about anything at all that you want to talk about, anything to do with the book or with the writing process, or how lucky I am that in the middle of my life I've just discovered, that what I always wanted to do, which was to be a detective and a writer, is something that I can actually do. So I'm all yours, and if you have any questions or any comments or anything at all, I'd love to hear it.
I wondered if this experience has affected your religious perspective.
Yes, it has in unusual ways. I was never a particularly religious person, in that I was brought up a Catholic, and I didn't, aside from a very brief moment when I was 9 years old, where I think as a desire to belong, I went around saying I wanted to be a nun. I have, and my mother cured me of that by sending me to school with some very, very strict nuns. I've never been a deeply religious person. I certainly, Catholicism didn't gel with it. I didn't believe in their basic tenets. I certainly didn't get any solace from their rituals. And I always felt like I didn't belong really in that group. If I had to choose a religion, I would, I think it's sort of chosen me. I would unhesitatingly choose to be Jewish. I realize, of course, that my mother isn't Jewish, and that for a lot of people that makes me not Jewish. But I think, I feel Jewish, if that counts. And how could I not, after what my family went through? And at the same time, I love the rituals, and I have a lot of Jewish friends, and I just love Shabbat dinners. We actually, I guess, call them pizza Fridays in my house, so it's not quite the same thing, and I don't mean any disrespect by that. But and the way the Jews mourn is just so, the Shiva is just so beautiful and to me so effective as a coping mechanism. So I've played with the idea of converting. I haven't quite got there in terms of mental space, and I've never been a very religious person, but if I was, I would unhesitatingly be Jewish. So I don't know if that answers your question or if it's at all, but that's where I am in terms of religion. And my children are not raised really with any religion. They for the last 10 years of their life, they've been hearing about their grandfather and my journey, and they've done a lot of this journey with them. My husband is an atheist and was raised in the Church of England, so we're big mishmash of things, and I hope they'll choose their own path. So
you excuse me, you said you hadn't really intended for this to be a book, for that it was just really a history of your family for your family, but that someone said, gee, you need to share this. And so what were your thoughts? How did you pare down these 2,000 pages to this? I think it's about 300 pages maybe now. How do you cut that stuff out, and how do you decide what to keep? How do you decide maybe this doesn't need to be in the book?
Well, you cut stuff out very painfully is the answer to that, because it's just, I mean, it's very difficult, and to decide what to put and what not to put. Because I hadn't written it all initially, and I just had the stories. When it first became a book, in the sense that I met with an agent, and I found her sort of very by chance, and she loved the story because it resonated with her, and she asked for some bits of writing that I had done. She helped me zoom in to the core of it. And initially, for example, I wasn't going to be in the book at all. So the book was going to be about my family, and you were going to follow my father, because obviously that's the one that I had the most information on, and his close family. But it wasn't at all about my journey, and I was very reticent to put myself in it, and I only did so because my agent, who I really love and who is way too good an agent to have taken me on, but that's a different matter, said, I will not help you if you don't put your journey into this book and put a bit of you into this book. So that's how I decided to put me in the book. And then there were a lot of other characters and a lot of other people who had incredible stories. There's a cousin of my father's, for example, who's barely mentioned in the book, who you could write a whole book about. But I tried to, you can't bore people to death with all these stories. You can't confuse them. Already the names were really confusing, and I wish I could have changed Stenek and Stenka. And so you just try, you try to focus on one story, and you put the characters in that help you tell the story. So I, for example, chose to leave the story of one of my father's cousins, who was in clandestine school. One, because I thought it was very there we go. English is not my first language, and sometimes it shows through. It's very illustrative. I thought her story, and I don't think there's enough about clandestine schools out there in Holocaust literature. And then there was my cousin's, my father's first cousin, who was killed in Auschwitz in Block 11 in 1941. And I thought that was crucial. I thought that was crucial to tell, because it was very early on, and a lot of people think that none of this really started to happen until 1942. And it was something that my father knew about, and that shaped his decision to go to Berlin. So, and actually I was so horrendously shocked when I saw the photograph of my cousin Otto, or my father's cousin Otto, that I really felt very strongly I had to include that. But Scribner at some stage said, there's too many characters, there's too much detail. The first 100 pages are going to, we're going to lose all these readers. So there was a little bit of a tussle. But I think that's how, it's all about telling one story and helping, using other characters to tell that main story, really.
Did you find any relief with, I mean, I know your dad passed away before the book actually came out, but did you find any relief and maybe repairing of your relationship, even though he was not able to participate in that part of the process?
Yes, I did. So and it's interesting because I hadn't sort of thought of it that way, but I think until you asked this question, I think I felt my relationship with my father was incomplete because I felt that I was missing a whole side to him, and he was not. We got on really really well, and we had a very close relationship of sorts, but we never discussed anything emotional. So I realize now, because I see how my children interact with my husband, that that's not usually how parents and fathers and daughters interact. But I didn't realize it then. I think I felt it. So I always felt there was something there that I needed to find out. And I always felt, again, so I felt having done this and having understood what the war did to him and the young boy, you know, who he was before the war, and getting to know that side of him, completely gave me closure and peace and brought me closer, if that's possible, to him than I ever really was. Of course, I don't know how he felt, but and I hope he felt we had a lovely relationship. But I think wherever he is, he'd be chuckling at the fact that it's a book and the fact that he's the hero in it. So.
Were there any people that you found, any family members or friends of your dad's or your grandparents that just weren't willing to share information with you, that the past was the past and they didn't want to open that door back up?
Not really. I mean, there were a couple. So I have a cousin, one of my uncle Lothar has two daughters, one who was incredibly helpful and gave me all this material. And the other one actually isn't interested in the past. But it wasn't harmful to my investigation because her sister gave me all of the stories and all of the material. And I think it's a very personal thing. And someone said to me the other day that every family has one person that carries the family history. And as long as you have one person in every family and that's willing to share the secrets or share their stories, then it's all right. But I was lucky that the first ones that I contacted in every family were very open and very willing. And even when the circumstances were tricky. So there's a little bit about it in the book, but my grandmother, when she was interned into Rezin for 2 years, had a friendship, perhaps an affair, with Engineer Langer. And that is certainly the way my grandfather felt about it, and it's talked about in the letters. And I traced Engineer Langer's daughter. And, you know, it's quite, first of all, I'm sure she wasn't expecting me to just appear on her emails. You know, I don't think she had really ever even heard of my family. So I didn't sort of go in and say, hey, I'm the granddaughter of this woman who was in a camp with your father and he had an affair with her, because that would actually be factually incorrect. I don't know that for a fact. And even she, because I eventually did say, listen, I have these letters, and the letters from my grandmother talk about your father in a really loving and wonderful way. And those of my grandfather as well refer to him, and he's very grateful to him, but he's also very jealous and feels that they had an affair. And even she, despite me saying this, because she could have easily gone, oh my God, you're just crazy and I don't want to talk about this, did the complete opposite and said, oh wow, that is incredible, and what do you know, can you send me the letters? So I sent her the link of the letters, and then she actually was flying via London to Europe from Melbourne, and she came and met me, and we had this really lovely 4 hours, and we're still in touch. And so no, everyone's, I mean, I'm so lucky, everyone's been, you know, people are quite happy to talk about their past and their parents, I think. At least it's my experience.
And we have a question from the audience. Did your experience as a journalist help in your research and writing of this book? And if so, how?
Yes and no. I think my experience as a detective as a child helped more than the journalistic side. I mean, I think the journalistic side helps in that you understand that you have to ask questions in a certain way, and you can't you have to be sensitive as to how you approach people, and that I learned as a journalist, because if you're aggressive with your questions, people block themselves, and if you're very direct with your questions, again, you don't necessarily get the answers that you expect. So yes, and being a journalist, obviously, you're, or at least when I trained to be a journalist, I think journalism has changed a little bit now because it's all so quick and fast. I'm not sure that we or journalists take the time to really investigate the stories so thoroughly, because everybody wants information now. So I think we've lost that a little bit. But when I trained, you really had, it was all about the research, and you always had to fact check things, and you always had to have, and that's also my training as a historian. I ensured that every bit of the story that I put in there, every story that I put in the book, had at least two different sources, so that I could ensure that they were accurate. Because, as I'm sure you're aware, we choose to remember things in ways that have much more to do with us than they do with the events that happened. So yes, it was very useful to be a journalist.
But your little young child detective agency really is what put you. Tell for those who might not have read the book, tell them a little bit about your detective club so they understand.
So when I was 8 or 9, I read a lot. I sort of read voraciously, and I read Enid Blyton and the Secret Seven and the Famous Five, and kid called Encyclopedia Brown, and Nancy Drew, and Agatha Christie. And I just really, more than anything in the world, wanted to be a detective. And I wanted to be a bit like, I don't know, a Miss Marple and a Lois Lane, just morphed into one, and shrunk to the age of 9. So I was an only child. I grew up in a beautiful, vibrant Venezuela, the 70s and 80s, and in a gorgeous house, and we had this beautiful garden. And in the back of the garden, there was a disused dog kennel, and we had, before, the people that they had Great Danes in the house. So it was a very big kennel, and it was pretty much disused, and I took possession of it, and I decided that we were going to have this club where we would meet up on Saturdays. We would spy on people in the house, and we would find mysteries to solve. So that's what we did. It was called, had a very serious name. It was called the Mysterious Boot Club. And we sat there on Saturdays, and we spent a lot of time just, there were lots of people that worked in my house, and my father was always around on Saturdays, so he was quite a good one to spy on. And we would sit there, and it was my cousins and a couple of my friends, and we would pretty much just, hide behind a tree and sort of poke, or behind a sort of half-shut door, and take notes on what people were doing and figure out what secrets they were keeping from us. So that's how actually I found the ID card on the box in the first place, because one of my cousins, called Rodrigo, said, your father, he was doing something really strange. He was in this long room that to which he only had keys, where he repaired watches, and no one was ever allowed in that room. And he moved a box from that room to some bookshelves, and he moved very slowly, as if the box had treasure. So I think I did this because it was my father, and I thought, okay, what if there's something really weird? I just don't want everyone else to find it too. I waited for them all to go, and I went and I found that box, and it was in the bookshelf that my cousin had said it was in. And I moved it, and it was really light, so I was really disappointed, because I knew immediately there was no treasure inside it. And instead, there was an ID card with my father's photograph, a stamp of Hitler, and someone else's name. So that was my.
That's your detective agency. That's how this all got started then.
I still have it. I'm in touch with the vice president of the detective club, who's my cousin, and we were talking about it. And we're going to have a meeting, a Zoom meeting, all together.
Hang on, I have another question. The letters and connections were obviously special treasures to you. I mean, lots of people don't know anything about their families, but were there specific archives that seemed to hold the most documents, or the ones that were most important, or
Yes and no. To me, I mean, the most important letters, the most important things that I discovered to me, and this is very personal, were my grandparents' letters. And those were not in an archive, those were kept by my uncle and his widow. And those were particularly special, first because they were filled with detail, but also because I didn't have grandparents, and I was never gifted with any anecdotes of them as I was growing up. So to have this window, this very, private, exclusive window into their souls and into their frames of mind, because there were letters that they didn't mean for anyone else to read, really, aside from their boys. So they were letters, for those that don't know, they were written between 42 and 44, and they were of two parents to their two sons who were outside of the camp and were, about 20 and 23 at the time. And they're all about the conditions in the camp and about their feelings and their frames of mind at the time. So I think it's quite remarkable because there were I have about 47 letters from them. I mean, it's quite an unusual window to get into your grandparents. So that to me is the most valuable. But there were lots of, I mean, if you're thinking about doing your own family history, I would recommend looking in unusual places, because often you'd go obviously to the registries of birth and death, and you go to the Jewish museums. But sometimes you have to go a little off-piste, and you have to go to the police files. And the police files tend to have a lot more stories than you would expect, because they keep incredible things. So, and this is quite a sad story, but one of the things that I found in a police file was, and this was someone who was peripheral to my family, so but the police file actually, it was very sad. It was a man in Prague in 1942 who was about to be deported, and he had killed himself just the day before, and he had abandoned, I mean, he was going to go with his wife, and he had decided he couldn't handle it. And the police file contained the doctor's report and contained the actual box of barbiturates that the person had taken. So I would my advice is, don't just go to Yad Vashem, don't just go to the Jewish Museum, don't just go to the town hall. Go and look at the tax records, for example, tell you incredible stories, and the police files tell you incredible stories. Not always the ones you want to hear, but definitely ones that add color and detail.
Were your grandparents special in that they had this contact that was able to get their names off the deportation list a few times? Was it that they had money that they were able to bribe people with? They escaped quite a few times from being deported. Your father, your uncle, your grandparents, some of the other members of the family. I just found that really interesting that they kind of were able to get around it. Obviously not with the finally everyone being back together, but was that something that was common? Was it unique to your family?
So it wasn't unique to my family, and it wasn't particularly common either. So it was, they weren't particularly rich. So, I mean, I say this, obviously they had a paint factory, but there were much richer people, much richer Jewish people in Prague, and indeed in Vienna and in Austria. And by the time that they were in the camp, they obviously had no belongings at all. They had lost everything. So any if there was any bribery going on, it would have come through Stenka, who wasn't Jewish and who had a little bit of money. Again, I wouldn't describe her as hugely rich. More than money, she was very, very engaging and very resourceful. And I would say that it was sort of my grandfather, it's a little bit the same, not that he was engaging or necessarily, but he was resourceful, and he fought the system every which way he could. So at some stage they asked him to be a trustee for the town, and he says no. So when they ask him for information, he just sort of doesn't give it to them. So he really fought the system, and I think he just hoped to gain a little bit more time, and like everyone, he hoped that the sort of Nazis wouldn't be in power for quite as long as they were. So I mean, obviously they had access to resources because of Stenka, but and bribing people. I mean, I'm sure that was going on, because I can imagine some people willingly risking their lives to help them, but I can't imagine they all did it just for, I hope some did it just to be good. So I think it was a combination of things, and it was unusual. It was very unusual to have someone like Stenka that snuck into the camp. Again, there are the stories of people sneaking into the camps, but there were 50,000 people in Theresienstadt, and there weren't 50,000 people sneaking into the camps for them. I think there's a couple of dozen stories of people sneaking in.
What was your uncle's state of mind? I mean, did you talk to him about how they married, they got divorced, they got married, then she wanted a divorce, and then she wound up showing up at his house in Sweden, I believe?
Yeah, in Switzerland, yes.
Switzerland?
Yeah, no, it's I didn't talk to him about it because, well, he died in 1992, and actually no one in my family ever spoke about it. And this was one of the greatest mysteries, because I still can't quite get my head around it. I don't understand how someone that was so crucial to my family during the war, even if she broke his heart in a gazillion pieces in 1947 and left him, how they could just not ever speak about her. So what was this? So any stories that I have from his daughter, and his daughter, again, is Lotter's daughter with another woman, and I think the presence of Stenka in the family was quite overwhelming. Actually, she was quite larger than life, and I think my uncle was absolutely madly in love with her. How could you not be? She was independent and beautiful and bold and generous, and really heroic. And then she leaves him for one of his best friends. So that really devastates him. And I mean, he was already pretty devastated by the loss of his parents and his family. And so I think the war destroyed him. Destroyed him is a strong word, but I think it really affected him much more than it did my father. And I think he always loved Stenka. I mean, when he died, he was still calling her name out. So he coped with the war differently than my father. He spoke about it much more to his daughters, for example, than my father did to me. Albeit his daughters they're my generation, but they're 20 years older than me. So they were closer in terms of the war was closer to them, I suppose, in terms of years than it was to me. But he believed in talking about it. But he was quite depressed about it. My father didn't talk about it at all, but his depression wasn't obvious if it was there at all.
Can you talk a little bit about when you went to visit the camp? You took your mom, you took your kids and your husband, and you had your translator and translator's husband. I mean, my younger daughter did a trip to Poland a couple of years ago, and she was only 16 at the time, and I know it was really difficult. It was hard for her. How did you feel being there? I know you write that the play of the light a little bit. You thought maybe you saw your grandparents, but what did your kids think?
Oh, okay. There's so many layers to that question. So I have to tell you that I actually, and this is not in the book, I went to a concentration camp a bit like your daughter when I was 16. I was taken by my high school, and we were going on a school trip to Munich because I went to a high school in Switzerland of all places, and we were on a minivan to Munich, and we stopped in Dachau. And at that stage, I didn't know anything at all about my family. Um, and I just visited the camp, and I was completely unable to speak. Um, I mean, I want to say for days, maybe it was just hours, and it just seemed like it was days, but I found it horrific. Going to Theresienstadt was less difficult, maybe because I had these letters which brought to my grandparents to life. And as harrowing as they were, and as harrowing as the camp was, somehow when they were there, I could hear their voices. And when I went to visit them, I could hear their voices, and I found great consolation in that. It was also not the place where they died, and I really just do not think I could ever go to Auschwitz, because, well, for a variety of reasons, but I also selfishly, I feel like I have them, and they didn't die in Theresienstadt, so I can walk around there and I can still have them with me. And I don't think I could do that in Auschwitz. Um, my children, my children were very affected by it. I think they took the view that they were coming from me rather than for themselves, which was incredibly generous because at the time they were, I don't know, 14, 12, and 11, and it's not where most kids want to spend their week, October holiday. Um, and they were just more concerned with being strong for me, I think. But they found it again very difficult and very moving. And actually, in the UK, they study the Holocaust from the age of 11, so they were all quite familiar with it. And then they were quite proud that they could go and speak to their classes about their trip and their grandparents. So and it's just a strange place, Theresienstadt, because it's not a purpose-built camp. So you enter it and you almost think that you're in any other town, any classical 19th century, 18th century town or 19th century town in Europe. It has a square and it has a church and it looks quite pretty. And when you think of the horrors that were committed there, then it's very sober. But the town itself, it's not like going to Dachau or going to Auschwitz, which was a purpose-built camp. So I don't know if that.
No, that's it. Going back to the people that you interviewed and reached out to, someone just wanted to know, was there anyone who said, no, you cannot put my stories in your book? Or
No, there wasn't anyone that said you cannot put my stories in your book. I was very careful because to me, this was a journey. I mean, I wanted to make sure that everything was accurate. But it was also a journey, I'm sorry if this is incredibly corny, but it was a journey of love, really. It was love for my father and for my grandparents and for this family that I never knew. So the last thing I wanted to do was to anger people. And I have a very good friend who's a writer for the New Yorker who said to me, oh, you write a memoir, no one, half of your family's going to stop talking to you. So I made sure that everybody that I spoke to, I said, listen, especially since from 2017, I'm writing this story. Is it okay if I do it? And I sent them the parts. So the engineer Langer's daughter read the bit of the book before it was published, and actually, so did my cousin. So Lotter's daughters again. One was interested and one wasn't interested. So one said, "You can put whatever you want in. I'm not reading it." The other one did read the bits about her father, and then actually read the whole book before it was published. And pretty much anyone that was mentioned, so Stenka's daughter, again, read all the chapters on Stenka, one, because I wanted to make sure that they were accurate from her standpoint as well. And there was not a single one of them that said, could you please take this out? So I'm lucky because I don't quite know what I would have done, or if someone has said, can you change the name? Or can you do something differently? So everybody was very good. It did mean that, my editor was going, no, you can't send all these things out to be sort of read. But it was very important to me that that everybody that was involved, particularly because they were so helpful to my family during the war, was happy with how I felt they should be portrayed.
Did your
Sorry, I lost.
Everyone, please type their questions into the chat box. That would be fantastic. What does your mom think about this? I mean, she didn't really know much about your dad either, I guess.
No, she didn't. And it's what there's a question. What does she think about it all, or was my poor mom? I think she's been absolutely wonderful. She is one of she she was exactly what my father needed, in the sense that someone said, how could she not have asked more questions? And my mom's always been someone that's very engaged in the present, and she's not that interested in the past, really. She's very active, and she just didn't ask questions. It was always that my father didn't want to know, so she didn't know. And someone asked me the other day, how much did she know? And I think she probably knew about 10% of what I've uncovered. So she knew the rough bits. She knew that my father had gone to Berlin at some stage during the war. She knew that my grandparents had been interned in a camp. She didn't know which ones. She didn't know for how long. She had heard a little bit about my grandfather being jealous. So she knew that detail, which I thought was interesting. But she didn't know, for example, that my father was in Berlin for 2 years. I mean, she knew that he had gone to Berlin and had pretended to be someone else, but didn't know the name of the factory, didn't know that he was a firefighter, didn't know that his best friend was there. So she discovered this whole new person, and I think actually it's explained a lot of how he was to her. And of course, they got divorced when I was 16 years old. So I mean, I think, and she's married to she has been married to someone else for 30 years. So I think a lot of it came as a huge surprise, and it was very difficult for her, I think, to read it all. And she read it in little excerpts, and she was hugely supportive as well, and came to the camp with me. And I mean, I think she said she couldn't allow her grandchildren to go to a camp, that she had to be there too. So she came to support me and to support them, and she's been hugely supportive. And she is the one that could speak about her own journey better than I can. But I imagine that it's been difficult, because what you expect from a parent in terms of honesty is completely different than what you expect from a person that you're in a relationship with, from a husband or a partner. So I think you expect to know them a little better than she knew my dad, or certainly to know about their past a bit more.
Did she know that he was Jewish?
We've had this, she said, not really. She didn't say, she said, I thought that he was a little Jewish. And I just sort of thought, what do you mean a little Jewish? But she sort of said, well, we never really talked about religion, and it wasn't a huge theme in our lives. So she said, I was what I was, and she wasn't particularly religious either. So she came from an old Venezuelan Catholic family, but it's not like she went to church. So she just said, I loved him for who he was. I didn't care what he was, and it was never, incredibly, it was just never discussed. I mean, but again, my father didn't like labeling himself, and maybe it's because, I don't know. I mean, I was sort of thinking, I was looking through the box, and I found these yellow stars that are in the box. And I thought, maybe if you and your family have been forced to label yourselves for so many years, and then you leave all that behind and you reinvent yourself completely in Berlin, then it's quite easy to do it again when you go to Venezuela.
Yeah. What's the most important point that you want readers to gain, or the most important insight from the book?
I think maybe there's three. Well, there's one is just to ask as many questions as you can of your parents, because I think often they don't tell you things because they're trying to protect you. And once they're gone, of course, you can ask those questions. So if you have parents, just ask all the questions that you have. I think that's important. I think what is on a more on a bigger note, important is to realize how insidious evil and anti-Semitism and racism is, and how it just creeps in. So it's not like the Nazis came in one day and said, right, off everyone to the concentration camp. No, it's just tiny. I mean, there were hundreds of laws. It was absolutely, it was almost imperceptible. And someone said to me, why did they not rebel? And I said, well, what are you going to rebel against? You're going to rebel against the fact that you have to hand in your typewriter, and then the next day it's your umbrella, and then the next day you can't sit in a park bench. I mean, it really was just an accumulation of tiny little steps that then leads to a complete dehumanization and then leads to the Holocaust. So I think that's important. And then what I hope they take out of the book is that, you know, really at the end, what remains when all is said and done, what remains really is just love and hope and family. And that wins over the racism and over the evil.
I think those are all the questions. This was fascinating. If you have not read the book, please, you can get it on Amazon. You can visit Ariana's website. I did have one other quick question. See, I forgot. Your dad took apart that watch when he was hiding in the paint factory in that little space that they built for him. Is that what started his lifelong, can I say, obsession with taking apart and putting watches back together?
It was definitely an obsession. If you saw him, you know, it was definitely an obsession. And yes, I think that is, I mean, he told me that was what started his fascination, he called it, with watches and with mechanisms. And I realize now that it must have been then, when he was confined in this tiny, tiny room and couldn't really move. And I think we get a little sense of it from the pandemic, right? I mean, sort of time has warped. You know, it's almost like the hours are going by, the minutes are going by, the seconds are going by so slowly. And yet, you know, we don't really quite know how much time has passed. I said to someone the other day, you know, I know we're in July and I still feel like we're in April. You know, it's sort of days and hours morph into one another. And I think there is a certain comfort with, you know, grabbing a watch and just, you know, taking it apart and just looking at the mechanisms and making sure that time is passing. Because if you don't have, you know, these plans that you're making and these rituals that you keep you engaged and active and human, then you lose track of time. And I think he found great solace from looking at mechanisms, which actually are really beautiful things that people, you know, people just look at the facade and they don't really care. I suggest everybody goes up and opens their watches every so often and sees the beautiful mechanisms, all the wheels and the pivots, and how stunning it is, all those little things that keep the tick-tock going.
So he might not have been open and talking about his past with you, but he certainly left you a treasure trove of information to find out about his life and your family.
He did. I'm really, really lucky that he did that. And I know now, I didn't when I started writing the book, but I know that he at some stage contemplated throwing it all away because he thought it's in the past and who cares? I'm not going to burden my daughter with this. And then I know he reconsidered it because I certainly asked a lot of questions and I didn't always get the answers, but I think he knew that I really, really wanted to know. And I'm hugely grateful because I think it's the only way that he knew how to tell his story.
You're going to write another book?
I'm working on it. Yes, I'm doing some research on a couple of stories which are sort of related but slightly different, and they're not about my family, which is good. It's a big relief. But they have to do with mysteries and they have to do with research and they have
just going to keep wearing that detective hat, huh?
Absolutely, absolutely. I intend to do that until, you know, I'm 99. Be Miss Marple and Lois Lane, just more.
There you go. There you go. Ariana, thank you so much for joining us. It was fascinating. Again, if you haven't read the book, please check it out on Ariana's website. I put it in the chat a little bit earlier. You can find it on Amazon. Take care. Thank you so much. Everyone be well. We're gonna start back up with our author conversations again the beginning of August. So please visit jccchicago.org. And everyone just take care and be well. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Hillary.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.